Good evening, everyone. NYTS family, I'm so delighted to be able to gather in this way, to come into your homes, to come into your offices, wherever you are centered and wherever you are right now for a Thriving Thursday. This is our first Thriving Thursday of the semester, and it is a rich experience that we know we will be engaging, that we will be offering today as we talk about a subject that is at the fore of civil and human rights today. As we think broadly, we think theologically, we think critically about how the carceral system in this nation demands. It begs for a faith response that is transformative, a faith response that is revolutionary, a faith response that meets and matches the moment in ways that help to shift and help to reorient who we are as human beings, who we are as people who live in this plot of America. I am Dr. Willie Dwayne Francois III. I am the Assistant Professor of Liberation Theology and the Director of the Master of Professional Studies program, which is housed at our North Campus at Sing Sing Correctional Facility. And tonight we have three panelists, three intellectuals, three leaders, three activists, three advocates who are going to help us answer this question of how can we reimagine prison education, but also how do we move towards an ecclesial ethic of decarceration. I don't know how many of you all know just how grave, just how dire the carceral reality, the carceral imagination is of America. It is easy to say that there is a school to prison pipeline. It is easy to say that there's a crib to prison pipeline. But in reality, if we're honest about the nature of our nation, is that it is not simply a pipeline, but we are really wrestling with a carceral continuum, because all of America's institutions are anti-Black to some extent. All of American institutions are really punitive. There's retributiveness that is embedded in so much of what we call America. And so we don't just live in a nation that has a pipeline to prison, but we live in a nation that is almost omnipresently punitive towards non-white bodies and poor bodies. And so tonight we'll have an opportunity to think deeply about carceral continuum that is the American project, this the experiment in democracy, the carceral continuum that has punitivity in so many of our institutions, from our schools to our formal carceral system, from our banking system, even to our housing system, is that there's so much punitivity, there's so much punitiveness in what it means to function as a nation. And we think deeply, even as we look at what happened on January 6th, we must be honest that there is a mass project in this nation to reforge a republic and our carceral system. From the ways we police until the ways we release, from the ways we police until the ways we release sisters and brothers back into society after they have been incarcerated, that there is something in the air, something in the water that is chronically punitive. And so I'm grateful that we have Apostle Only Love Austin with us today, who is the founder of Prophetic Whirlwind Ministries, and she also gives leadership in so many other areas across New York City, but really so many other areas across the nation. Grateful to have Professor Jamal Joseph, who is a writer, director, poet, producer, activist, and we are grateful to have one of our students, a student of the New York Theological Family, an MPS student at that, brother Jose Pineda, who is also an activist, but he gives leadership to student recruitment at Bard Prison Initiative, and is the executive director of After Incarceration. And so we're going to hear from them. I'll pose a question to them, and then we'll feast on their wisdom. We will see them as the sacred stories that they are, the embodied sacredness that they are, as we hear the fundamental ways, the practical ways, even the theoretical and the philosophical, the theological ways that we are called to treat the needs of people as holy. It may sound normal. It may sound easy for us to understand that America uses its prisons to solve so many of its problems. And what we find more and more again, that prisons do not solve poverty. Prisons do not solve our mental health crises. Prisons do not solve addiction. Prisons do not solve unemployment. Prisons do not solve America's inability to take seriously its own self-proposed, self-acclaimed mandate of being a place that is interested in protecting and advancing the unalienable rights of all people, and is used prison as a way of defaulting on so many of its promises. And I think it is important to say that although the United States is roughly 5% of the world's population, that we house 25% of the world's incarcerated population. It is really reprehensible if we think deeply about it, that once slavery ends in 1968, the American prison population is less than 200,000. The 100 years between 1865 to 1968, we see that the American prison population is roughly around 200,000. And then from 1968 until the years that are known as the Reagan years, the American prison population, up until the Reagan years, the American prison population is about 250,000. It is from the Reagan years until this very moment that the prison population has grown from 250,000 to 2.2 million brothers and sisters who are behind bars in some ways. And that does not include the invisible ways that we keep people on controlled, on state control through probation and through parole. And those numbers increase beyond 7 million people who are under state control, under correctional control. So we've seen in about 60 years a 900% increase in our prison population. And so much of that has been targeted at brown and black women and men, boys and girls in places like New York State for so long. And so I'm excited that we're able to have this conversation around how do we think about decarceration. I will not pretend that everybody's an abolitionist. I will not pretend that everybody's a reformer, a strict reformer. There's so many ways that many of us sign on to the work of decarceration, and we have three luminaries in that work today. And so I'm going to toss this first question to Apostle Austin as you help us get a window into your own life, a window into your own activism. What animates, what initiated your own vocation for decarceration?
Greetings, everyone. Greetings to you, Pastor Willie. Honor to my elder, and greetings to you, brother, and greetings to the president of NYTS, Dr. Waldron. So, I actually was born and raised for most of my life in East New York, Brooklyn, one of the 7 communities in New York City that sends the most people to New York State Prison. I have never been incarcerated, but I have had family and friends incarcerated. And I have a huge heart for the silent crisis of Black women who are being incarcerated. My faith, which was forged in Pink Houses Projects, which was forged when I was in foster care, which is a pipeline for prison. When my family became homeless, my little brother and I went into foster care. And so only for the grace of Yahweh go I, because many that are incarcerated actually were in foster care. And so I started to notice that while they were taking the men out of the front door and locking them up, that they were taking the women through the back door. The highest number of people going to jail for the first time are actually Black women of childbearing age. That is me. And so I am honored to learn from Brittany White, who organizes in the Faith in Action Network, who's a formerly incarcerated woman, Tamisha Torres from Faith in Action. Well, she has her own organization now, Reverend Donna Hilton, Reverend Sharon White in the Justice for Women Task Force, which is a task force started by women who served on Bedford Hills and Rikers Island. Because during this whole COVID crisis, women have been suffering in jails and not getting the attention that they need. And so my faith also, as an adherent of Torah, animates what I do for justice. The concept of tikkun, repairing the world, but also the fact that I follow Yeshua, the Black Messiah, who was falsely accused, wrongly tried, and executed. Yes, he rose in my faith, but we still have to look at the fact that if you follow Yeshua, you follow someone whom the justice system failed. And so, when I look at young people who are incarcerated, I think about how, as a foster child, the state separated me from my parents because my father lost his job and we lost our home. And so I don't just talk about the school to prison pipeline. Since about 2014, I've been talking about the womb to prison pipeline because for many women, it may not end in a police officer taking her life, but it may end in her being raped. It may end in a woman who is visibly pregnant being beaten to the ground by cops. I was contacted about a Latina woman who was visibly pregnant and beaten by the cops in Brooklyn. Brenda Hardaway from upstate New York was on camera visibly pregnant and beaten to the ground by cops while the brother in her life was restrained. And she said, "You're going to kill my baby." So there are many incidents that I've been keeping track of where visibly pregnant Black and brown women have been beaten by the cops. And we need to include that in our reform conversations, include that in our abolitionist conversations. So my faith and my testimony is what animates me to do this work.
Good. Thank you so much, Apostle Only Love. And we do give a grand shout out to our leader, our womanist leader, our womanist president, the Reverend Dr. Lakeisha Walren, who we know is with us tonight. And we are so grateful for her leadership. And on behalf of the entire board, we welcome everyone, the entire NYTS family. We welcome everyone to this experience that is really, really angling in on how faith communities and the apostle has really hooked us up with thinking about how her faith drives her experience, but also her faith drives her to this work. Professor Joseph, same question to you. And I know you have a very unique way of thinking about both politics and prison as a result of your own experience. And you come to this work as an artist as well. Can you give us a window into what sparks this for you?
I joined the Black Panther Party in New York City when I was 15 years old. Raised by my grandmother, a working grandmother, and joined, as I mentioned, joined at 15. 2 months after I turned 16 years old, a police tactical team, they would be called a SWAT team today, kicked in grandma's door at 4 o'clock in the morning and took me away in handcuffs. And I was arrested as part of the New York Panther 21 case. This is the same case that Sister Afeni Shakur was part of. So I went from being an honor student and a church boy to being in Rikers Island, which was Gladiator School then, as it still is now. The difference for me as a Black man child was that I realized that I was a political prisoner because of what the system was meant to do. In the Panthers, when someone got out of prison, we wouldn't say so much that they got out of prison, but we would say they had been transferred from maximum security to medium security or minimum security, because policing in our communities are an extension of the slave patrols. And the slave patrols was about control and conditioning. If a slave ran away, they were guilty of the highest crime, which was stealing property. In other words, if you were trying to liberate your black or brown body, you were stealing the master's property. So you were punished severely for this and being made example of. The other thing that a slave would be punished severely for was being able to read. So see the connection between those two things and the work that we're talking about with prison education. I was released on bail on the Panther 21 case. We were eventually acquitted, but I went back to prison for other movement-related charges, hiding people out who were on the run from the FBI, weapons possession charges, and spent a total of 9.5 years in prison. And I earned degrees in sociology and psychology from KU, from the University of Kansas. I also started a theater company when I was in prison, and at first we thought we were doing a play for Black History Month. Some brothers knew that I was part of the Black Arts movement that was happening simultaneously to moving stuff in Harlem and in San Francisco. People like Sister Sonia Sanchez, Amiri Baraka. So word got out that I had done plays, and they asked me to do a play for Black History Month. Some of the Latino brothers came to rehearsal. We thought it was gang war. This was like the Mexican mafia. We thought they were there because they had beef with someone. And one of the brothers watched me rehearsing. They pulled me to the side and it was like, yo, Essay, I need to speak to you. And I was like, the beef is with me? I just got here. And he says, yo, those guys you're working with, Essay, they're not feeling they're not feeling their character. So I put them in. Some of the white brothers came, and before you know it, we had a multicultural theater company, and the rate of gang violence in Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary actually reduced, further reduced for those men that took advantage of those prison programs. But I came back to Harlem where the rate of incarceration had gone up, although we had called it out, and although we had made that connection between profit and prison. It's one of the reasons in those days that your grandmother would call a police officer, would call the police when someone was on the fire escape trying to kick in her window, and the cops would come a half hour later, if at all. But a white store owner on 125th Street could say there's a suspicious looking black man down the street looking like he's thinking about robbing the store. They would be there before he can hang up. So they were there to, as with slavery, to protect property in the interests of the white establishment. But what we found that art did, and what we found that education did, was make people realize that here's the difference, that our moving back and forth, this rate that a few years ago in Harlem that said 1 in 3 black men had been in prison or was somehow under, and I include black and brown men, and I'm speaking as someone who has Cuban ancestry as well, Afro-Latino, that 1 in 3 men, black and brown men in Harlem, have been affected by the prison industrial complex, being incarcerated, or as you mentioned, Dr. Francois, under some kind of carceral control through probation, parole, whatever the case may be, that this work has to continue. There's a context for where we're at, but I'll hold that for a little bit later. But I think we have to be aware, and if you could just prompt me with this idea of co-conspiracy in terms of the carceral system.
Jose, this is your first semester at the South Campus. You started your journey with us as a seminary at the North Campus at Sing Sing correctional facility, and you represent so much of the type of student, the kind of relevant, revolutionary student, radical student that NYTS is positioned to release into the world and desires to release into the world. So talk to us about your spark into this work of decarceration as you are really embedded in doing education as a practice of liberation.
Absolutely. First of all, I want to say that I am no exception to this, right? There are thousands of men that I've come into contact with personally over the course of 21 years in prison that are more than capable, if not excessively capable than I am, to make contributions to our communities. And there's men that NYTS has graduated prior to me that have done phenomenal things in the reentry world. I seek to walk in their footsteps and stand on their shoulders. But the spark for me was really on a cold, wet day in April 2020. It was the day that I was released, right? And you would think that being released from prison after 21 years would be this ecstatic moment. But instead, I felt a tremendous feeling of dread because I was returning to the very same community I had been removed from 21 years earlier. And I was doing so knowing that I had never really been held accountable to the people that I hurt, and that the people that I hurt included the direct family of the person whose life I had taken in 1999, and an extended network of family and friends that would live within a 10-minute radius of me, right? And so I was scared to death. I wasn't scared that anybody was going to come for retaliation. What I was ultimately afraid of was somebody was going to corner me in the Dunkin' Donuts parking lot and demand answers for what I had done. Answers that nobody had been given this entire time. And answers that, if that's what they need, as uncomfortable as they would make me feel, I feel obligated to give them. So what I did is I refused to just accept that the ordinary parole process was the way that it had to be. And so I sought alternatives through restorative justice to try to facilitate healing within the community that I was returning to. And what made that possible, though, was my education in prison. It was my education in prison that opened my imagination to be able to think about doing things different than the way they've always been done, right? And so that's my entrance into this world, because I had no intention on maintaining my ties to anything that had to do with prison when I was released, until I really understood that this is a struggle that doesn't end when you walk out them doors. There's ongoing barriers that people need support with.
So there's a lot of, particularly since Michelle Alexander wrote her book, The New Jim Crow, there have been these buzzwords around mass incarceration, right? These buzzwords that help us to sort of identify that the carceral rhythm and calculus of this country is not really about, maybe not really about individual actions, but there is, as I love how Professor Joseph said, there is this conspiracy, right? An organized conspiracy of racialized social control for certain bodies, right? And even thinking about that racialized form of social control intersecting with class, right? Because you really can't untangle race and class, right? It's really it's disingenuous to do so, it's unproductive to do so, but it's also not possible to do so. Give me some feedback. Let's just like popcorn this. When you hear the term mass incarceration, what comes to mind for you?
Well, if I may, the thing to remember about mass incarceration, and the reason why I use the word co-conspiracy, was that the 1984 Comprehensive Crime Control Bill, which took away the discretionary powers of federal judges, the most powerful judges in the country, for sentencing. They had to sentence you according to a grid. This was adopted by the states, more funding for prisons, opened the way for private prisons, was a bill that was sponsored in the Senate, or co-sponsored in the Senate, by Ted Kennedy, whose nickname was the Liberal Lion. And what happened was that Democrats who were losing ground to Republicans, this harkens to what we're going through today, had to appear to be tougher because the Republicans had created a narrative that Democrats were weak, not protecting the country, not protecting citizens, and that they were the ones, sound familiar, that could protect us. And so the Democrats said, the thing that we can be strong on, that nobody will blame, is crime. Well, we know that is code for being hard on communities of color because we
Right.
didn't vote, because the contributions weren't coming from there, the taxes weren't coming from there. So that bill, and ironically, Dr. Francois, I was in prison writing my thesis paper for University of Kansas in a prison cell, writing about this topic, and other men who were going to KU political science class with me, we predicted in this paper all of this that was coming. Men who were in prison saw the rise in numbers, saw the rise in private prisons. It's low hanging fruit. And by the way, Black communities, Black politicians, Black Black non-for-profits, Black clergy signed on to this. Help us. There's a crack war. There's an epidemic. You know, if you follow horror science fiction, if you like vampire movies, they say the vampire can't come in your house unless you invite them in, right? You have to say, come in, Mr. Vampire, come in, Miss Vampire. We invited that in, not realizing that we were saying that you are now sentencing generations, not just this kid that you can't get to turn down the music, that's selling crack, who needs some counseling, who needs education, who needs a job, who needs to be able to understand from someone that they respect that those organizational skills, those math skills, all of that can get them through college, and that they could be working, you know, as accountants, as attorneys, as teachers, but just lock them up because they're making noise. We didn't realize we were sentencing that young man, their son, and now their grandchildren to being incarcerated. This co-conspiracy still exists. Oh, now Democrats are waking up. Hillary Clinton, and Bernie Sanders talked about mass incarceration during a presidential debate. Now we're talking about that, but unfortunately, the rest of the country, and especially since we are in this backlash, this racist backlash, right? That the narrative is that, we will be extinct. And in part of what's being spoken is, of course, immigration. But if you open the floodgates and let these Black and brown men and women, these people of color out of prison, they will overrun our communities. They will rob your grandmothers. They will rape your daughters. That racist notion still exists. So as much as it has gotten better in terms of folks coming out and being able to get counseling and jobs and participate in restorative justice programs, we have to look at this overall narrative that we are still fighting, and we have to fight both. And lastly, I'll just say, and for our young men, and women, they are still fighting a sense of doom and hopelessness. As much as we know and we believe, as my brother and my sister and doctor, as you has said, the goodness in people, the ability, if given a chance, to restore, to refresh, to regenerate in their own community. As much as we believe that, we have men and women. I'm in Harlem, just on the street corner, on the corner where I live, who still believe that they will be dead or in jail before they're old, or if they're 21, certainly before they're 25. If they're 25, definitely by the time they're 30, they're 30. So the education does need to be an education of spirit, does need to be an education of faith. And if they're not a member of an organized church, if they're not following Yahweh or Jesus or Allah, if they're not doing that, there was a basic thing we were taught in the Black Panther Party, that if you asked any member, and the movement at that time, in particular Panther, asked them, what were we taught to believe more than anything else? And we had our 10-point program and our position on self-defense and the free breakfast program. Guarantee the question will be answered this way. We were taught to have an undying love for the people. And if you understand that love, you understand that starts with self-love, and let everything you're doing, even risking your life, be motivated by love. That faith education has to happen before the first arrest, before the first frisk, before the first thing, and has to continue on, so that self-love makes them know that I am more, I can do more.
And thank you so much, Elder. I wanted to just add on that when you sentence that young man to a bid, yeah, you're sentencing his children, his grandchildren, and whatever women are in his life, whether that's his mother, grandma, or partner. They're doing that bid with him. And Reverend, when you asked your question, two stories came to mind. One story was when A young woman I was organizing was volunteering in a women's prison with children who have been born in prison, who could stay with their mothers up until the age of 2, and then they went into the system if family didn't take them. They were preparing the children to take them out to a park, and the children did not know what to do with jackets because they hadn't been outside yet. And that really impacted me because those children are also doing a bit with their mothers. And when you understand prenatal health care, it is a travesty for a woman to give birth while shackled. And that child feels the trauma that the mother's going through when she's pregnant. But another story is part of my work is working with West African Jewish communities. And when I was researching for my book about some West African Jewish communities, I started to learn about the Inquisition. And at one point, and I shared this with the young people I worked with and organized at Urban Youth Alliance Bronx Connect. Their motto is keeping youth out of jail for life, and we organized a lot of the court involved youth, and I taught them about mass incarceration and the 13th Amendment and the history, and we went through the companies that benefited from mass incarceration. And these young people, they were I organized clergy for many years. I love you, clergy, but those young people were some of the most on point people I had ever organized. And they started the Right to Remain Silent campaign to end youth being interrogated by police without counsel present. But when I did research, Angola, the country, which the first 20 enslaved Africans in America came from Angola. Angola was actually a prison colony at one point for Jews being expelled in the Inquisition. So Angola prison colony during the Inquisition. Many of the enslaved brothers and sisters in Louisiana came from Angola, served on Angola plantation because it was named Angola plantation because so many of the enslaved people were from Angola. And then it was turned into Angola prison, which exists today. And some of the cells are actually remodeled slave cabins. So do you see Angola, the prison colony for people being expelled in the Inquisition, Angola plantation, Angola prison? And so when we think about co-conspiracy, when we think about mass incarceration, I don't just think about a big system, I think about a long system that's been rooted in 400 years of oppression. And Angola prison is a perfect example of that. And when I showed the young people Angola prison, they were floored. I mean, Rikers Island was bought from a slave owner. It has a prison barge. And I have worked with people who did their time on the barge, and they said it felt like a slave ship. And so when I think about mass incarceration, I don't only think of what started when I was a little girl in the 90s. I think all the way back to 1619 when those first 20 brothers and sisters were brought from Angola, because prison is just another form of slavery. And when you look at the amount of companies that are benefiting from prison labor, you see how deep this goes. It is a co-conspiracy.
Yeah.
And Nellie Fuller, the ancestor that wrote a lot about race, but he's passed on, he said greater confinement. So either you're incarcerated, which is greater confinement, but when you get out, you're in lesser confinement. Like a captivity, like when we think about the Babylonian exile of the Hebrews, they were in captivity. They weren't enslaved like they were in Egypt, but they weren't free like when they were in Zion. Captivity is when you're halfway free, you're halfway a slave. And so even brothers and sisters who think, oh, well, that's not me, I've never been in jail. But when you think about the surveillance against Black lives and the disdain for Black bodies, you are just in lesser confinement.
I'd just like to add one thing, and that's what comes to my mind when I hear mass incarceration is the image of Black bodies just lined up in the hallway waiting to go to the yard, right? Like I remember walking down the hallways in prison, and it's just Black, brown, Black, brown, Black, brown, Black, brown, Black, brown, all the way down the hallway. And it's like you would think that this country is like has 5 white people in it. So and also I just want to add too that what came to mind when Professor Joseph spoke is the importance of the imprisoned radical intellectual, right? So Professor Joseph, you were writing a dissertation on what was going on in that moment, breaking it down, able to help other people understand the significance of something that the media was glossing over, that societies was glossing over. And if it wasn't for your voice, many people wouldn't have seen that. And if it's not for the problem with media review in prisons is it censors out that radical intellectual voice that can help us to reimagine the world. And the only place that's safe from that censorship is the classroom, So I just leave it at that.
I think that's so powerful what you just brought up, Jose. One of my mentors who actually did the inaugural teach-in for NYTS's Center for Restorative Justice. He's in his 90s now. He helped to organize the state of Virginia for the 1963 March on Washington. And one of the things he said about the program that you are a beneficiary of, that you bring credibility to, actually, Jose, is he says that the MPS program is really the best version of the Malcolmization of incarcerated men.
That's right.
Like when he talks about the Malcolmization, he's talking about how people go to he says, this is his language. Malcolm goes to prison as a hustler, but comes out as a hero, right? Mm-hmm. And he's saying that what that you're naming this confinement of these radical intellectuals made me think of even how Professor Joseph are a part of this legacy of how education is a part of the Malcolmization of Black and brown men, the Malcolmization of people who've been incarcerated but have found ways to reinvent themselves. That's Manning Marable talks about Malcolm as the life of reinvention. That is a very powerful point of even thinking about the legacy that still lives of a Malcolm X. Of people who don't even align themselves with Malcolm X, but that is a tradition that I think, to use our president's language again, that speaks to the resilience of the human spirit under the most tyrannical circumstances, right? Let me say this. So we gotta talk about the church because we're 37 minutes in. We gotta talk about the church just for a moment. But Apostle Only Love brought up something that's interesting. Angola. We should never forget that the casket that America's evangelist was buried in, his name's Billy Graham, the casket that America's evangelist was buried in was a casket that was built by men at Angola prison in Louisiana, right? And these men got pennies for this casket that was built for who we call America's greatest preacher. That is an indictment. Not just on the American evangelical tradition.
That's right.
That's an indictment of Christianity of sorts. Tell me why. Tell us, because this is about an ecclesial ethic of decarceration. What should the church be doing?
Well, I'm going to say the church, and because of my tradition, the synagogue, I'm going to say any Black faith tradition, any Black faith institution should be dedicated to the freedom of our people. You should be reading the scriptures through the lens of a people who started out as slaves, became free, and then went in a constant state of captivity. We have to understand that, as one of my mentors said, Reverend Michael Ray Matthews, either you're a chaplain to the empire or you're a minister of the resistance. And we really need to think about the ways in which some of our doctrines around sin, around hell, around darkness itself, how these doctrines feed into locking up Black and brown bodies. Many still think that Black people are cursed of Ham. And Ham wasn't even cursed. It was his son Canaan. And that was fulfilled when he served the Levites in the temple. And all Black people don't come from Ham. Some come from Shem. But we are still preaching white supremacy oftentimes. One of the biggest demonic spirits, and this is for my Pentecostals. I know NYTS has spirit-filled people. One of the biggest demons that we need to be casting out and binding and speaking against is the demonic spirit of white supremacy, where we have recreated America as the promised land and recreated an idol to whiteness. And even when you have the white Jesus up in your church, and you're doing the Good Friday 7 last words, but you don't touch on the fact that Yeshua was convicted. Apostle Paul was convicted, not just for preaching the gospel, but Apostle Paul murdered some people too. Daniel was in jail. Joseph was in jail. But we sanitize these stories where we don't go and visit the people in prison, or where we minister to them when they're in prison, but when they come home, we won't give them a job. So we have to think about the way in which our theology in Black houses of faith co-conspired, as our elder said, our theology co-conspires with the system of mass incarceration, because many of us deep inside, we think blackness is sin. We think darkness is sin. But in Song of Songs, chapter 1, verses 5-6, it says, I am dark and lovely. But most of your English Bibles will say, I am dark but lovely, which is an apology, and it's a mistranslation, because in Hebrew, vav can mean and or but. So white Bible translators could not say, I am dark and lovely. They had to say, I am dark but lovely. Why am I bringing this out? Because what you preach, what you teach, what you pray, who you prioritize, that all feeds into a system that co-conspires to lock up Black bodies. And so the church has to see this as one of the top priorities, that our brothers and sisters are losing their youth behind bars. This can't be a side thing that you give to a lay person just to keep them busy. This needs to be the main thing, especially if you follow Yeshua, the Messiah, Jesus Christ. You're following someone who is an ex-convict. You're following someone who was wrongly incarcerated.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can't say you follow him, but the people that most likely represent him today, you ignore. So we really have to think about the doctrines that we are pushing that actually sanctify this. It is that actually bless what is happening. We got to think about the Black clergy that went along with the crime bill. We have to grapple with these things as Black faith leaders. What are you teaching? Are you worshiping the idol of white supremacy? Are you worshiping the most high God who created man from dirt, which is black or brown? Who are you worshiping and why?
Here's the challenge with that, and agree with everything you just said, what you just said, Apostle, and what you just prophesied. But the politics of the church, the economics of the church, not unlike voting, has to do with where your support and where your money is coming from. So to be able to convince established Black churches, Latino churches, my grandmother, who barely spoke English, gave every extra dime she had to the Spanish speaking Seventh-day Adventista church that she went to, is dependent upon the support of those folks who are still bought into that narrative of if you're white, you're just right. If you're Black, get back. If you're brown, stick around. You know, that song that was a hit song in the 1920s and all the way through. Churches who are doing this work built their constituencies differently. And so they opened the doors, understanding, you know, when Pastor Mike and Dr. Lakeisha came to Harlem, they came to a broke down spot that had about 300 members, and they said, and he was told, you can't open a church in Harlem. And he says, I'm not trying to open a traditional church. And he built his constituency on that kind of service, on saying anyone is welcome. And, you know, in terms of how you identify sexuality, we're going to deal with mental health, we're going to deal with poverty. When Dr. Francois came there, he continued that. When he went to start took over his ministry, he built that foundation on that constituency. The problem that we're having, if you go to other places and want them to do more than just the visits and, just the prayer circle that, that nephew Jimmy gets out, makes parole this time, is that there has to be a fundamental shaking up of where your resources come from, and that you're not hanging on to power for the sake of power, that you're preaching for the sake of truth, justice, and freedom. This is why even in prison, guys on a Sunday morning would go to Christian services to pass messages, but they would go to Juma or Moorish American or even a yoga thing that brothers was doing for faith. The church wasn't affiliated with that. So that has to happen in terms of challenging what their institution is. And if not, those institutions that understand the church is just not brick and mortar, four walls, people who do want to minister in that way and serve in that way, understands that that can be a grassroots movement. And this is fundamental to the mission of what we have to do as activists and revolutionaries.
Thank you.
I know Jose's getting ready to hop in there, but this I've been trying to get people to understand that the same way we talk about school to prison pipeline, womb to prison pipeline, when we talk about Jesus, we need to talk about the manger to cross pipeline, because Jesus comes from a crucified class. Jesus comes from a crucified people, a carceral people, and a carcerable people. And there's no way to really think about how we undo mass incarceration without having some serious conversations about Jesus, particularly like at some point we got to have some conversations about atonement theory. Our atonement theory, one died so the rest of us could be good. We have to have some questions on how that feeds into how we let Black bodies disappear so the rest of us can feel safe.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And even that the Hebrew people were oppressed by Rome, were killed by Rome, were treated the way police treat us. But Brother Jose, I'm sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you, but
that's all right. I'll be brief, but I think that this is an important point, because when I think about the role of faith communities in decarceration or in relation to mass incarceration, I think about the role that faith communities played during the Great Migration, where people were seeking to flee from oppressive conditions, and it was the churches in the northern cities that stood as beacons of hope for liberation from a condition of oppression, right? And I think that there's something in that tradition that can be revisited in this time in order to then reimagine how it was that faith, which is really just the ability to maintain a sense of personal worth in a world that tells you you ain't nothing, in a world that tells you you don't even belong here, right? If you can say, you know what, no, I do, and I am a valid human being in this world, that's faith, right? And that's what the faith communities need to be fostering to those who are suffering the most serious form of living dehumanization that can happen in incarceration. And so that's my piece.
So let me ask this, right? We're talking about this ecclesial ethic of decarceration. You guys do very particular work. What does winning look like in your work?
I want to share a story. There's immediate results that you see in the work. And I was smiling earlier when we were talking about the motivation. I think Brother Jose was talking about the brilliance of and the scholarship that comes out from the men and women, he, she, and they, who are coming out of prison. I'm a professor at Columbia University, and I've been there for 23 years. And so my children, two of my children had the benefit of going there. You got to have the grades, but they had the benefit of going there tuition free. My daughter, who graduated from undergrad, got her undergrad degree, hated being in those classes in general studies with people who were formerly incarcerated, hated being in those classes because they would raise the bar so high. Yes. She would be like, Dad, I'm in with this woman who did 7 years. I'm in with this guy. They get the papers in early. They read all of the work. They make it bad for the rest of us that are just trying to be normal college students. So that, that looks like winning. Those institutions opening up, as Columbia is now doing, from the business school and other places that are embracing folks. winning also looks like not giving up. I'll tell the story very quickly. One of my first jobs when I came home from prison was working in a program called Changing Scenes that was helping young men on parole and probation get their resumes together, some job training, someone said, let's have an arts component. And I was like, I'm ready for this. You know what I mean? I have my degrees. I started a theater program. In prison, we did plays. And I had my curriculum. We were going to do a one-act play, and then their families were going to come. The first week that I was there, family, I had to throw my curriculum out the window because these brothers were just talking about who they had beef with, where they had the gun, where the gun was stashed. And it became clear that I had to take the temperature down and defuse the situation. So I had folks circle up, and I was bringing in all kinds of other work, not just, the theater work, right? And let people do a cipher. And then based on that, that's what the workshop would be, and just do something. And I have to admit, it's the one thing that I thought that I failed at, because, the contract ran out. I went on, and I've been blessed to do many, many other things. About 10 years ago, I'm walking down the street with my eldest son, who has his master's in film from Columbia. And there's a young man about 30 years old, 35 years old, standing by a bus stop. And he sees me and he says, Mr. Joseph, Professor Joseph, I'm so glad I'm seeing you. I was one of those knucklehead kids in that program, Changing Scenes. And so naturally I defaulted and I said, no, you weren't a knucklehead. He says, Mr. Joseph, I was a knucklehead. He said, but every week you would come in with this positive stuff and I wasn't trying to hear it. He said, but 2 years later, it kicked in. 2 years later. And I'm so glad I'm seeing you because I'm a social worker now. I'm a husband now. I'm a father now. Thank you. And it reminds me of when you're gardening and some of the wind comes and blows some of the seeds away. You see the roses that you planted there, and then you're walking someplace else. And as my godson Tupac said, then you see this rose that grew from concrete, and you go like, how did that sprout up? Not even realizing it's the seed that blew from your hand. So we have to be consistent, insistent, and persistent with this work because we're dealing with broken and wounded folk. And we can't give up knowing that we're dealing with post-traumatic stress syndrome, as I like to call it, post-traumatic slave syndrome, other things that have to be done to build people from the inside out, which is why what we're talking about, faith combined with education, with love is the formula, and be vigilant that and train people who are doing the work that they have to have that kind of patience to be what Dr. West calls a long distance revolutionary.
I could add what it looks like for me, right? It kind of looks like driving in the city when you're in traffic, right? And you're trying to get over into the right-hand lane and everybody's acting like they don't see you. They don't see you. And the reason is because if they see you, they got to work with you, right? They got to let you in, or they got to intentionally be that guy that doesn't let you in, or that girl that doesn't let you in, right? So for me, winning looks like being at a place where we can see each other, and we can hear each other, and we can recognize that we all bring something to the table that can make this world a different place. We don't have to accept the world the way it is, and we could work to make it better, but we need to be able to see each other. So,
to me, winning, I'll mention two battles that winning that I would love to see us win is one, passing legislation in New York City and across the country so no child is interrogated by police without counsel present. And then two, closing Rikers. About 2 weeks ago, 10 souls died at Rikers. And then long term, the big win for me is total, complete liberation for our people, a reestablishment of our homeland, Africa, and our identity as Yahweh's people. And so I want to win a lot of little things, but ultimately, I want us to have total liberation.
Dr. Francois, you're
Yep, we're really bumping up against our time today. Obviously, we could go on with this for hours and hours because it is just that crucial. We know that life and death is really at stake when we talk about the carceral system is something that the apostle said to us earlier, is that helping us to reimagine mass incarceration is not just those who are behind bars, but how mothers and how children in some ways are doing time along with their loves, partners, and how children and parents, siblings are doing time as well. Just as a final word, we all know that activism and community organizing, that in that vein, we experience countless heartbreaking, gut-wrenching disappointments and antagonism. Help us understand what keeps you energized for this work that could also keep us energized for this work.
My main energizer is seeing the young people who have taken up the banner and who are fighting. From it starts. I'm reminded. Sister Apostle talked about women being handcuffed while they were pregnant. My oldest son had an M16 pointed at him when he was in his mother's womb. When the last time I went to prison, when the FBI kicked in the door and pointed a gun to her head and at her pregnant belly, and she had to yell, "Get off my back." To see him thrive and flourish and tell that story with pride and owning that ownership of legacy, that ownership of understanding that what you think breaks me down is part of my resume and privileges me to be able to see the world in a different way, in a broader way. So I'm inspired when I see young people doing the work, and I'm inspired when I see other people who have been incarcerated or been affected by it, holding it up as a banner to be proud of and to move forward, and says that I stand on the shoulders of the great prophets, the apostles, the leadership of those of Malcolm X. I come from Malcolm X, University, and I'm here to, as Muhammad Ali said, to shake up the world.
So what inspires me is our people's history and learning more of our history, like from our elder this evening, and then also the practice of Shabbat, the practice of resting and ceasing, because I trust that the Most High God is going to give justice for our people, so I can rest one day a week. So that's what keeps me going.
Ashe.
For me, it's the constant reminder that I'm not operating in a silo, that there are people that believe the same things that I believe, that are not willing to just accept the world that it is, and who are committed to doing things with intention to create the world that we all deserve to live in.
Well, thank you, Professor Joseph. Thank you, Apostle Only Love. Thank you, Brother Pineda, for your brilliance, for allowing us to benefit from your strategic and comprehensive vision for how we get to a place of decarceration. And we look forward to the wonderful work that you will continue to do. And hopefully, as a seminary, we will find ways to partner in the work that you do. This has been an awesome evening. And so I thank our panelists, but I also want to thank you all for joining us on Facebook, but also joining us on YouTube for such an important conversation. These conversations will happen monthly. Our Thriving Thursdays will happen monthly. This was just the first of our semester engagement in this way, and I think we're off to an auspicious start. I don't want us to forget that mass incarceration, that incarceration, the carceral continuum, is not something that's just happening over there. It's not something that's happening to them. It is important for us to understand that as a seminary is committed to urban ministry and urban leadership and urban movement and urban movements, that 75% of the women and men that make up New York State, that make up the New York State incarcerated population, come from 7 to 10 neighborhoods in New York City. New York City is actually feeding the carceral machine, the carceral cannibal of of New York State. And so this is all of our work to do. And it's the same is true from Chicago. The same is true of Atlanta. The same is true of Houston and Dallas. Our cities are feeding our prisons that are so far out of sight and out of mind. So we have great work to do. We want you guys to stay engaged with us. Make sure you visit www.nyts.edu. Follow us on social media. That's Instagram, that's Twitter, that's Facebook. We want to be in conversation with you. We want you to see us as thought partners as you continue to do the radical, revolutionary, relevant work that you have been called to do. And we hope, we pray that ending this carceral continuum is a part of the work that you feel God calling you to do as you follow Jesus, as you follow the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, as you follow the teachings of Torah, whatever your faith tradition is. We hope that you will see the work of decarceration as a part of that work. Thank you, everyone. Again, we thank our president for her visionary leadership, also for being with us today. We thank the faculty of NYTS, the student body, the real heroes of our institution, of which Jose is a contributing member of that community. And we thank our three panelists for being with us today. You all have a great night. If there's nothing else, I want everybody to have a great night as you log off. But as you log off, you're logging into the movement, into the revolution, into the work to make sure that justice really goes down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream.